My husband cheated and secretly drained our savings to fund his affair and his exit. He assumed I never watched the money. Here's how I followed every dollar. Most people, when they find out their spouse is cheating, feel their heart break. And mine did. But right behind the heartbreak, something else kicked in. A very cold, very quiet instinct that said, follow the money. Because my husband, I'll call him Greg, wasn't just having an affair. Greg was funding one. With our money. The savings we'd built together, the cushion that was supposed to be our security, Greg had quietly been draining to bankroll a secret second life. Dinners, trips, gifts, a little apartment I didn't know about. And, I would later discover, he was squirreling away cash for the day he planned to leave me and start over, leaving me with a fraction of what we'd built. Greg made one very expensive assumption. He assumed I didn't watch the money. He assumed that because he handled the accounts, I'd never notice, never check, and never understand what I was looking at. He was wrong. And this is the story of how I followed every single dollar he hid, clawed all of it back in the divorce, and made sure the exit he'd been secretly funding blew up in his face. Settle in. This one is a paper trail, and it ends exactly where it should. Let me set the scene. Greg and I had been married for 9 years. He was the money guy in our marriage, not out of anything sinister at first, just how we'd fallen into it. He paid the bills, managed the accounts, handled the investments. I trusted him with all of it. That trust, it turned out, was the whole vulnerability. The first thing I noticed wasn't lipstick or a text, it was a number. I happened to glance at a savings balance that should have been higher than it was, noticeably higher. When I mentioned it, Greg had a smooth, immediate answer. A bad quarter, an unexpected expense, a transfer he'd explain later. Reasonable, if you weren't paying attention. I started paying attention. Here's the thing about me that Greg forgot. Before we were married, I worked in a field where I read financial statements all day. I wasn't the money person in our marriage because I couldn't be. I was the money person who chose to hand it over. And once my instincts woke up, they did not go back to sleep. I didn't confront him. I want to be clear about why, because it's the whole strategy. If I confronted Greg, he'd do 3 things instantly. Move the money somewhere I couldn't see, build a cover story, and start documenting his own version of events. Confrontation would have destroyed the one advantage I had, that he thought I was oblivious. So I said nothing, and I started quietly pulling the thread. Over a few weeks, I built a complete picture of our finances, not the picture Greg presented, the real one. Every account, every card, every transfer, and the pattern was damning. Cash withdrawals in amounts and at a frequency that made no sense for our life. Charges at restaurants and hotels on nights he'd told me he was working late. A recurring payment I traced to a small apartment across town. Gifts, jewelry that never came home to me. And, most tellingly, money moving out of our shared savings into an account I'd never seen, an account Greg had opened in his name alone. That last one was the tell. Greg wasn't just cheating, Greg was preparing. He was quietly building a war chest with our marital money so that when he finally left, he'd land softly and I'd land hard. I made copies of everything, dated, sourced, organized, and I kept them somewhere he would never look. Then I did the smart thing. I took my folder to a divorce attorney, and, on her advice, to a forensic accountant. That's a real thing, and if you ever find yourself where I was, remember it. A forensic accountant's entire job is to find money that someone is trying to hide. Mine went through everything I'd gathered, and everything we could subpoena, and laid it out cleanly. Here is the marital money, here is where it went, and here is the amount Greg had dissipated and concealed. The number was worse than I'd feared. Greg had moved and spent a very large sum of our shared savings on the affair and on his own secret landing pad. And here is the part he never understood. Hiding marital assets in a divorce is not a clever move. It is one of the single worst things you can do in front of a judge. Courts punish it, hard. When one spouse is caught concealing or dissipating assets, judges routinely award the other spouse a larger share to make up for it, sometimes far larger. Greg thought he was building a secret advantage. He was building the case against himself. But I still didn't move. Because as long as Greg believed I was clueless, he kept doing it. He kept spending. He kept moving money into that account. He kept, in effect, adding pages to my file. Every week I stayed quiet. The evidence of his concealment got stronger, and the eventual math got more lopsided in my favor. So I waited, calm and pleasant, playing the trusting wife who never checked the accounts, while Greg confidently dug his own hole deeper. When I finally moved, I moved all at once. No argument in the kitchen. No tipping my hand. My attorney filed, and Greg was served, with a divorce petition backed by a forensic accounting of every dollar he'd hidden. I almost wish I could have seen his face when his own lawyer explained what he was looking at. Because Greg had walked in expecting to control the narrative, hide behind the accounts he'd always managed, and walk away with the war chest intact. Instead, he was confronted with a complete, professional, court-ready map of exactly what he'd done with our money, the affair spending, the secret account, all of it. There was nothing to argue. You cannot talk your way out of a paper trail. The settlement was not close. Faced with documented dissipation and concealment of marital assets, Greg's position collapsed. The court did exactly what courts do in that situation. It made me whole. The money he'd hidden was accounted for and credited back to my side of the ledger. The savings he drained on the affair were treated as marital money he'd have to answer for. When the dust settled, the secret war chest Greg had built to give himself a soft landing was largely awarded to me, as compensation for the very assets he'd tried to steal. Greg didn't just fail to get away with it. His scheme actively made his outcome worse than if he'd simply been honest. The hiding was the crime that cost him. And the affair? The great second life he'd been funding with our savings? It did not survive contact with reality. The woman he'd been spending our money on was, it turned out, considerably less interested in a Greg who no longer had money to spend. Once the secret account was drained back to me and the comfortable landing pad evaporated, so did she. Within a couple of months, Greg was alone. No marriage, no mistress, and no war chest. Just the apartment he'd secretly rented, which he now actually had to live in. I'll be honest with you, because these stories can sound colder than the truth. Finding out the person you trusted with everything had been quietly robbing you for months is its own particular heartbreak. For a long time, the betrayal hurt more than any settlement could soothe. But there is a deep, steadying satisfaction in one specific thing. Greg's entire plan depended on me being exactly the person he decided I was, trusting, uninterested in the money, easy to manage. The most powerful thing I ever did was quietly stop being that person, months before he had any idea. So here's the lesson, and it's the same one every time on this channel. People who betray you almost always leave a trail, and the ones who betray you with money leave the clearest trail of all. They're betting you won't look, won't understand what you're seeing, and won't have the patience to build the case. Prove them wrong quietly. Know your own finances, even when someone else handles them. If your gut says a number is off, pull the statements. And understand that hiding money doesn't make someone untouchable, it makes them vulnerable, because the concealment itself is the thing that sinks them. If this one landed, subscribe. There's a new story like this every week. And tell me in the comments, have you ever caught someone hiding money? Did you follow the trail or let it go? I already know my answer. I'll see you in the next one.